morning, Laguna Woods. It's another day and another digging into this series of shows that we've been doing on the Bible. And we're doing that on the Bible based on a verse that the Apostle Paul, actually out of a letter that he
Mhm.
wrote to his disciple and the one he was mentoring, young man named Timothy.
Timothy.
And so we've been really digging in, especially into this first. Well, go ahead and read the verse. Joan.
Okay, it's First
This is
Timothy.
Joan McConville, and she has been a great sidekick in these shows.
First Timothy, chapter 3, verse 16. All scripture is God breathed and is used for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness.
And so last series of shows, we dug into that word God breathed. Inspired. But today, Joan, we're going to actually talk about a word that's earlier in that, and it's the word all. All, what's it say?
All scripture
All scripture.
is God breathed.
So, the question that, because we're encouraging everyone to be like a jury and think it through, is there evidence that the Bible that we have, is it reliable in that it's God breathed, but it also, the logical question is, do we have the actual Bible that God intended for us to have? And that word says all.
Scripture.
So that's pretty inclusive, the word all.
Mm-hmm.
So, do we have all scripture? Because the Bible was put together by people. Is it the ones that God wanted? Those are very legitimate questions. And so I want to give us some answers.
Oh, good.
And some history of how this happened. Now, so there's two aspects to that, actually. One is, do we have the right books? And secondly, do the books we have actually reflect what was written? Because let's face it, up to 4,000 years ago, some of these books were written.
Mm-hmm.
Do we still have the same words? Those are legitimate questions.
Mm-hmm.
So, let's just deal, first of all, do we have the right books? Well, there's two aspects. Do you know where we get the Old Testament?
Well, the first 5 books we got from Moses.
Yes. And then you also had the Psalms and what's called
From David.
and then the prophets and that. But it's a history book too, and that. Well, pretty much the Christian church accepts what the Jewish people, the Hebrew nation, the Israelites, what they accepted as scripture. And they were, how can I say, perfectionists in copying what was written. Now, the Old Testament's written in Hebrew. And Hebrew actually is written from right to left. You read this way. But it pretty much lines up in columns. Well, they counted all the letters, both this way and this way. And they made sure that each copy that was handwritten, because there's no printing, obviously, had those numbers. Nothing was added, nothing was deleted. And so they totally believed that they had the writings of God to them. We agree. I agree.
Mm-hmm.
It's so
because what was the penalty if they got it wrong?
Exactly. Well, shame at the best. But now we were talking about a little bit earlier about the Dead Sea Scrolls a little bit. Well, that's a huge win for the church. That indeed, at one point in time, in the late 1940s, these scrolls that date back and include every Old Testament book, except the book of Esther, but every Old Testament book, they found fragments to that date back all the way to the years of Christ. And when they compared those to what we have today, guess what? They were the
Accurate.
same. Nothing had changed in that time. It's an amazing uh, assurance that what we have is accurate. Oh, also that they recognized those were the Old Testament books, by the way, which is interesting.
The part that interests me the most about that is that they were discovered during my lifetime. It's
Yes.
not that I'm looking back 2,000 years. That happened, that they discovered them during my lifetime. And so
Yeah.
how could you dispute that?
Well, I don't think though. I don't know. They don't really
Mhm.
dispute that they found them and that they do these things, that they make these
Yeah.
things. But so that's the Old Testament. Now the New Testament, obviously, there were several criteria that the early church had. They wanted it to be eyewitness reports
Mhm.
of people that were there when
Mhm.
Jesus was walking, and that was the apostles.
Mhm.
And indeed, that they had authority, and even all the letters of Paul, and of course, and the other letters of the New Testament were written by people that had seen Jesus. Now, Paul saw him as the risen Lord on the road to Damascus, as we know. But so that was a lot of his authority. But the reality is, in terms of which books would be included in the Bible, there was almost no debate. And the church was already using and acknowledging these books as eyewitness accounts. And so they were being used in the same way as Scripture, as the Old Testament. So there were church councils a couple hundred years later where the church formalized what the Bible would be. But they were only recognizing letters that were already being used, and then they put them together in a book, and that's why we call it canonicity. What should be in the canon? The canon is, I think, the Greek word for book, but anyway, that's how the New Testament came about. So it's not like there was any debate, but there is a little step of faith that we believe that God not only worked in the authors, because as we've seen, there's total evidence of that God inspired, breathed out what the writers wrote, but we also have to believe that if he cared that much, that he would indeed be in these church councils that recognized which books would be officially be in the Bible. And that's how we got our Bible. There were groups of people that gathered together and said, these are the ones that should be in our Bible.
And their letters.
I don't know. I did, there's such a variety, but those are the factors that went into deciding. And if you ever, I don't know if you've ever read. I've only read one or two, but there's certain other books that were written similar time about Jesus. And if you read those, they're almost silly.
Really?
Yeah, like as a kid, Jesus threw a rock and hit a bird, it died, but he healed it. I mean, it's stuff like that. I mean, so the church never wanted to recognize those extra writings as equal with Scripture. So, well, Laguna Woods, I'm gonna. There's a whole nother area that dealing with, if we have the books, are the words in those books accurately portraying of what God said? So we're going to spend one little 10-minute show on that topic. And I hope you find that interesting, because critics do often say, okay, you have the book, but how in the world do we know what Paul actually wrote? That was 2,000 years ago. I'll tell you why tomorrow. See you then.